Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The photograph first surfaces in the spring of 2018 at a small estate sale in Knoxville, Tennessee. An elderly woman named Margaret Holloway passes away at 94, leaving behind a modest house filled with generations of accumulated family belongings. Her grandnephew, sorting through dusty boxes in the attic, discovers a leather portfolio containing dozens of aged photographs, most dating from the early 1900s. Among them is an image that immediately captures attention. The photograph, measuring 8 by 10 inches, shows a group of people gathered at the edge of a creek in what appears to be the Appalachian Mountains. The quality is remarkable for its age, the details crisp despite more than a century of existence. In the center stands a man in dark clothing, his hand extended over a small child who appears to be partially submerged in the shallow water. Several onlookers line the rocky bank, their faces solemn, their clothing worn and patched. The scene resembles countless baptismal photographs from rural America at the turn of the 20th century, a common practice among fundamentalist Christian communities throughout the Southern Highlands. The grandnephew, a history teacher named David Morrison, finds the image compelling enough to share with colleagues at the University of Tennessee. He photographs the original with his phone and emails it to the history department, suggesting it might have value for their Appalachian Studies archive. Professor Eleanor Hartwell, a specialist in Southern Appalachian culture and social history, opens the email during her office hours on a Wednesday afternoon. She studies the image on her computer screen for several minutes, noting the clothing styles, the landscape features, and the apparent poverty evident in the subject's appearances. Something about the photograph troubles her, though she cannot immediately articulate what feels wrong. The composition seems correct for a baptism, the setting appropriate, the participants dressed in their best available clothing despite its threadbare condition. Yet an inexplicable discomfort settles over her as she examines the faces more closely. Eleanor saves the image and begins preliminary research that same afternoon. She enlarges different sections of the photograph, studying the background details, the expressions of those present, the physical positioning of the figures. The man performing what appears to be the baptism wears a dark suit that shows significant wear, particularly at the elbows and collar. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, reveals hard lines and a grimness that could be interpreted as religious solemnity or something far less benign. The child in the water cannot be more than 4 or 5 years old, small-framed and thin, wearing what looks like a simple white shift. Most troubling to Eleanor are the faces of the witnesses. Rather than the joyful expressions typically associated with baptisms, their faces display a mixture of discomfort, resignation, and what might be interpreted as shame or moral conflict. Over the following weeks, Eleanor contacts David Morrison and arranges to examine the original photograph. She visits the Holloway estate, now in the process of being cleared for sale, and spends an afternoon in the dusty attic where the portfolio was discovered. The leather case contains 37 photographs in total, most showing ordinary scenes from early 20th century Appalachian life. Coal miners emerging from a shaft, their faces blackened with dust. Women tending small garden plots on steep hillsides. Children standing barefoot in front of rough-hewn cabins. Families gathered for what appear to be funerals, weddings, and other significant occasions. The baptism photograph stands out not because it is dramatically different from the others, but because of subtle details that become more apparent with repeated viewing. Eleanor photographs each image with her high-resolution camera and returns to her office to begin serious archival research. She contacts the Tennessee State Library and Archives, the Appalachian Studies departments at several regional universities, and the historical societies in counties throughout East Tennessee and western North Carolina. Her initial inquiries focus on identifying the location shown in the baptism photograph. The creek appears to flow through a narrow valley with steep, forested slopes rising on both sides. Large rocks and boulders line the banks, and the water looks shallow and clear, typical of mountain streams throughout the region. In the far background, partially obscured by trees, a rough wooden structure is visible, possibly a church or community building. A breakthrough comes 6 weeks into the investigation when a reference librarian at the North Carolina State Archives recognizes the location. The distinctive rock formations and the profile of the mountains in the background match a site in Mitchell County, along the Tow River near the community of Spruce Pine. This area, in the early 1900s, was home to numerous mining operations, particularly mica and feldspar mines that employed many local residents in dangerous, poorly paid work. The librarian sends Eleanor several historical maps and photographs from the same period, and the geographical features align almost perfectly with the baptism image. Eleanor travels to Mitchell County in early autumn, driving through valleys that have changed dramatically since 1903 yet retain the essential character of their mountain landscape. She visits the local historical society, housed in a converted general store building in downtown Spruce Pine, and meets with volunteer historians who maintain archives of regional family histories and photographs. She shares digital copies of the baptism image, and several of the volunteers study it with interest. An elderly man named Robert Buchanan, whose family has lived in the area for 5 generations, examines the photograph closely through reading glasses, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he holds the printed copy. After several minutes of silent contemplation, he sets the image down and removes his glasses, his expression troubled. Robert Buchanan explains that his grandfather, who lived until 1972, occasionally mentioned disturbing practices that occurred during the most desperate years of poverty in the mountains. During economic depressions, mining accidents, crop failures, or other catastrophes, families sometimes made terrible decisions to survive. He remembers his grandfather speaking once, and only once, about children being given away or sold to families in other regions, transactions that were disguised or rationalized in various ways to make them seem less shameful. The old man never provided specific details, and Robert, as a child, did not fully understand the implications of what was being described. Now, looking at the photograph, he wonders if his grandfather's veiled references related to events like what the image might document. Eleanor spends 3 days in Spruce Pine and the surrounding communities, interviewing elderly residents, examining church records, and searching through county courthouse archives. She discovers that 1903 was a particularly difficult year in Mitchell County. A series of mine collapses in the spring killed or injured dozens of workers, leaving families without income. Crop failures due to late frosts destroyed much of the subsistence agriculture that sustained mountain communities. By summer, desperation had become widespread, and local newspapers from the period contain numerous references to families breaking apart as individuals sought work elsewhere or as children were sent to live with relatives in other states. The county courthouse records reveal something unexpected. Among property transfers, business transactions, and routine legal matters, Eleanor finds several documents labeled as adoption agreements or guardianship arrangements. The language in these documents is formal and legally constructed, but the circumstances they describe seem unusual. Children, some very young, are transferred from their biological parents to individuals or couples from outside the county, often with financial considerations explicitly mentioned. One document, dated August 15, 1903, records the transfer of a male child, age approximately 4 years, from a father named Silas Garrett to a couple named Herschel and Ida Mae Thompson from Asheville. The agreement specifies a payment of $60, a substantial sum for the period, and includes language about the child being raised in appropriate Christian circumstances and provided with education and care. Eleanor photographs the document with growing certainty that she has found a connection to the baptism photograph. The date aligns with when the image likely was taken, based on clothing styles and photographic techniques. The location connects to Mitchell County. The financial nature of the transaction contradicts the typical arrangements for adoption or guardianship, which usually occurred between relatives without monetary exchange. She requests additional records and discovers that Silas Garrett owned a small plot of land near Spruce Pine and worked intermittently in the local mines. County tax records show that he fell significantly behind in payments during 1902 and 1903, and by late 1903, the property was seized for unpaid taxes. Research into the Thompson family reveals that Herschel Thompson owned a successful general merchandise store in Asheville and served as a deacon in the First Baptist Church. He and his wife Ida May had been married for 12 years but had no children. They were known in their community as respectable, financially comfortable members of the middle class. Census records from 1910 show a male child, listed as their son, named Samuel Thompson, age 11, living in the household. The timeline fits perfectly with the August 1903 transaction. What had been presented as an adoption or guardianship arrangement appeared to be, in essence, a sale. Eleanor returns to Knoxville with copies of all relevant documents and spends several weeks constructing a timeline of events. She determines that the photograph was likely taken on the same day as the transaction, possibly immediately before the child was transferred to the Thompson family. The setting at the creek, initially interpreted as a baptismal scene, may have served multiple purposes. In Appalachian communities, creekside gatherings were common for various reasons, including baptisms, but also for community meetings, informal legal proceedings, and other significant events. The presence of witnesses, the formal positioning of the participants, and the photographic documentation all suggest that this was understood by those present as an important, if uncomfortable, occasion. Eleanor Hartwell presents her preliminary findings at a faculty seminar in late November. The response from colleagues ranges from fascination to skepticism. Some question whether she is reading too much into circumstantial evidence, whether the connection between the photograph and the legal document is coincidental rather than causative. Others express concern about making serious historical claims based on limited documentation, particularly claims that reflect so negatively on individuals who cannot defend themselves or explain their actions. Eleanor acknowledges these concerns but argues that the convergence of evidence, the specific details in the courthouse records, and the troubling aspects of the photograph itself warrant further investigation. She decides to pursue multiple research paths simultaneously. First, she attempts to trace what happened to the child after 1903 to learn whether Samuel Thompson, as he became known, lived a good life with the Thompson family or whether the transaction led to exploitation or abuse. Second, she investigates Silas Garrett's circumstances more thoroughly, trying to understand what desperation or calculation led him to make such a decision. Third, she searches for other similar cases in the region during the same period to determine whether this was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern. Fourth, she attempts to identify other individuals in the photograph and locate their descendants, hoping to find oral histories or family stories that might provide additional context. The search for Samuel Thompson proves surprisingly straightforward. Asheville city directories from 1910 through 1945 list him at various addresses, first as a student, then as a clerk in his adoptive father's store, and finally as the owner of the business after Herschel Thompson's death in 1931. Marriage records show that Samuel married a woman named Ruth Edwards in 1923, and census records indicate they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, between 1924 and 1930. Samuel appears to have lived an ordinary middle-class life, integrated into Asheville society, with no obvious signs of trauma or exploitation in the public record. Eleanor locates Samuel's obituary from 1968. He died at age 69 from heart failure, survived by his wife, his 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. The obituary describes him as a respected businessman and active church member who served on various civic committees and contributed to local charities. Nothing in the public documentation suggests anything unusual about his background or upbringing. Eleanor wonders whether Samuel himself knew the truth about how he came to live with the Thompson family, whether he remembered his early childhood in the mountains, or whether that part of his life was deliberately obscured or forgotten. Through public records and genealogical databases, Eleanor identifies 2 of Samuel's grandchildren still living in the Asheville area. She contacts them, explaining her research carefully and asking if they would be willing to discuss their family history. One does not respond to her inquiries. The other, a woman named Patricia Brennan, age 62, agrees to meet for coffee at a cafe near the Biltmore estate. Patricia arrives carrying a manila folder containing family photographs and documents. She explains that she always found her grandfather's early life somewhat mysterious. He rarely spoke about his childhood, and when asked, he would provide vague answers about growing up in western North Carolina without specific details. His wife Ruth once mentioned to Patricia's mother that grandfather Samuel sometimes had nightmares and would wake crying, but he never explained what troubled him. Patricia opens the folder and spreads several photographs on the cafe table. Most show Samuel as an adult, standing in front of his store, posing with his family, attending church events. But one photograph, creased and faded, shows a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing stiffly beside a woman in Victorian-era dress. The boy's expression is solemn, almost haunted, his eyes staring directly at the camera with an intensity that seems unusual for a child. Patricia explains that her grandmother Ruth kept this photograph in a jewelry box and told Patricia's mother that it was taken shortly after Samuel came to live with the Thompson family. Ruth described Samuel as deeply withdrawn during his first years in Asheville, speaking very little, startling easily at loud noises, and showing what would now be recognized as symptoms of trauma or severe anxiety. Eleanor asks Patricia if she knows anything about Samuel's biological family or the circumstances that brought him to Asheville. Patricia says that her mother once asked grandmother Ruth directly about this, sometime in the 1980s after both Samuel and Herschel Thompson had died. Ruth was elderly by then, in her late 80s, and living in a nursing home. She told Patricia's mother that the Thompson family never discussed Samuel's origins openly, but Ruth had once found a legal document among her husband's papers that described an arrangement with a family in Mitchell County. The document used language about guardianship and Christian duty, but Ruth understood, even as a young bride in the 1920s, that something about the situation had not been entirely proper. She never confronted Samuel about it, respecting what seemed to be his desire to leave the past behind. Eleanor shares the baptism photograph with Patricia, explaining her theory about what the image actually documents. Patricia studies it carefully, her expression becoming increasingly distressed. She points to the small child in the water and asks if Eleanor believes this might be her grandfather. Eleanor says the timeline fits, the location matches, and the legal records support the connection, but without additional confirmation, she cannot be certain. Patricia remains silent for several minutes, then quietly begins to cry. She says that learning her grandfather was essentially purchased as a child reframes everything she thought she knew about him. His silences, his nightmares, his intense focus on providing for his own children, his reputation for extraordinary generosity to struggling families in Asheville, all of these things suddenly make sense as responses to profound early trauma. Eleanor's investigation into Silas Garrett proves more difficult. County records show he was born in 1876, the son of subsistence farmers in a remote hollow near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. He married a woman named Cora Phillips in 1896, and their first child, a son, was born in 1899. This son would have been approximately 4 years old in 1903, matching the age description in the legal document. 2 more children were born in 1900 and 1902, but neither survived past infancy, according to death certificates filed with the county. Cora Garrett died in February 1903 from complications following childbirth, the baby dying with her. These deaths occurred during one of the worst winters in local memory, when heavy snows isolated mountain communities for weeks and medical care was almost impossible to access. By the summer of 1903, Silas Garrett was a widower with 1 surviving child, no source of steady income, and mounting debts. Mine records show he worked sporadically but suffered from lung problems, likely early-stage silicosis from breathing mica dust, which limited his ability to perform physical labor. His small farm produced barely enough food for survival, and the land was rocky and steep, unsuitable for profitable agriculture. Local newspaper archives contain a brief mention of Silas Garrett in July 1903, noting that he had been charged with public intoxication and disturbing the peace in Spruce Pine. The charges were dismissed after he paid a small fine, but the incident suggests a man spiraling into desperation. Eleanor locates descendants of Silas Garrett's brother, who also lived in Mitchell County. They agree to share family stories, though with considerable reluctance. One elderly woman, Margaret Garrett Simmons, age 89, says her father, Silas's nephew, occasionally mentioned Uncle Silas in terms that combined pity and disapproval. The family understood that Silas had done something shameful involving his son, though the specific details were never discussed openly. Margaret's father said that Silas left Mitchell County in late 1903 and was never seen by the family again. Rumors circulated that he had moved west, possibly to Oklahoma or Texas, seeking work in oil fields or on ranches, but no one knew for certain. The family did not speak of him, treating his name as something to be avoided out of embarrassment or anger. Church records from Spruce Pine Baptist Church, where Silas Garrett had been a member, show that he was quietly removed from the membership roll in September 1903. No explanation is recorded, but the timing suggests that church leadership became aware of the transaction and responded with silent condemnation. This informal shunning, Eleanor realizes, would have made Silas's position in the community completely untenable, providing additional motivation for his departure. The Appalachian culture of the period emphasized family bonds, children as blessings, and parental duty as sacred obligations. A man who sold his child, regardless of his circumstances, would have been regarded as having committed an unforgivable moral transgression. Eleanor's research into similar cases reveals that the transaction involving Silas Garrett and Samuel was not unique, though such arrangements were rarely documented so explicitly. She finds scattered references in courthouse records, newspaper articles, and social welfare reports from the early 20th century describing children transferred between families under questionable circumstances. The language varies, sometimes presenting these as adoptions, sometimes as apprenticeships or indentures, occasionally as guardianship arrangements necessitated by parental death or incapacity. In most cases, financial compensation is not explicitly mentioned, but often there are references to the receiving family assuming debts, providing employment, or offering other economic benefits to the biological parents. A social worker's report from 1907, discovered in state welfare archives, describes investigating a complaint about children being removed from mountain communities under suspicious circumstances. The investigator notes encountering resistance from both the families giving up children and those receiving them. Both parties insisted the arrangements were voluntary, motivated by desire to provide better opportunities for the children, and conducted with appropriate legal oversight. The investigator expresses skepticism but acknowledges having no evidence of coercion or abuse sufficient to justify intervention. The report concludes with a recommendation for stricter regulation of child placements, but Eleanor finds no evidence that such regulations were ever implemented. Eleanor identifies 3 other photographs in the Holloway estate collection that, upon re-examination, appear to document similar transactions. One shows a teenage girl standing between 2 couples outside a courthouse, her expression vacant, her body language suggesting resignation rather than happiness. Another depicts a young boy sitting on the steps of a large house in what appears to be a more prosperous town, looking uncomfortable in new clothing that does not quite fit. The third shows a group of children lined up in front of what might be an orphanage or institutional building, their faces displaying a uniformity of sadness that transcends individual circumstance. Eleanor realizes that Margaret Holloway, or someone in her family line, had been documenting a hidden history of child displacement and economic desperation in the Appalachian region. Research into Margaret Holloway's background reveals that her great-aunt, Constance Holloway Mercer, worked as a visiting nurse in rural Appalachia during the 1910s and 1920s. Constance traveled throughout the mountains, providing basic medical care, health education, and social support to isolated families. She kept detailed diaries, several volumes of which survive in the Holloway family papers. Eleanor obtains permission to examine these diaries and discovers extensive observations about poverty, malnutrition, preventable diseases, and social dysfunction in mountain communities. Constance writes with compassion about families struggling to survive and with anger about the systemic neglect that left them without resources or support. In an entry dated October 1917, Constance describes visiting a family where children were obviously malnourished and living in conditions of severe deprivation. She writes that the mother confided, in a moment of exhaustion and despair, that she wished someone would take the children and give them better lives, even if it meant never seeing them again. The mother said several families in neighboring hollows had made such arrangements during hard times, and while everyone knew these transactions were shameful, they were also sometimes necessary for the children's survival. Constance notes her own conflicted feelings, recognizing the genuine love these parents felt for their children while understanding their calculation that poverty might inflict worse harm than separation. Another diary entry, from April 1922, describes Constance encountering a man who had grown up in the mountains but moved to Charlotte and achieved modest success in business. He revealed to Constance that he had been purchased as a child by a family that needed farm labor, and while they treated him reasonably well, he always knew he had been bought rather than chosen out of love. He described feeling like merchandise, valuable for his work capacity but fundamentally different from the family's biological children. Constance writes that she asked whether he resented his biological parents for selling him. The man responded that he understood their desperation but could never fully forgive them, and he had never attempted to locate them or reconnect with his origins. Eleanor begins to understand that the baptism photograph captures a moment in a much larger story, one involving thousands of families across Appalachia and other impoverished rural regions during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The formal setting, the witnesses, the photographic documentation, all suggest an attempt to create legitimacy for a transaction that participants knew was morally problematic. By staging the event at a creek, by including community members as witnesses, by documenting the occasion with a photograph, those involved were constructing a narrative that might make the transaction seem less like a sale and more like a solemn transfer of responsibility, blessed by the community and perhaps by God. By late winter of 2019, Eleanor has assembled a substantial archive of documents, photographs, interview transcripts, and historical records. She begins writing a scholarly article for the Journal of Southern History, intending to present her findings in an academic context that will prompt further research and discussion. As she writes, she struggles with how to characterize what occurred in August 1903 at that creek in Mitchell County. Was it a sale, an adoption, a rescue, or something that defies simple categorization? The legal language of the document describes guardianship and Christian responsibility. The circumstances suggest economic transaction. The photograph captures something that looks like religious ritual but functions as legal documentation. Eleanor contacts a colleague in the law school who specializes in child welfare law and historical legal practices. Professor Michelchen reviews the 1903 document and explains that the legal framework for adoption, guardianship, and child custody was extremely underdeveloped during this period. Most arrangements involving children occurred informally, negotiated within families or communities without court involvement. When legal documents were created, they often used vague language about Christian duty, proper upbringing, and mutual agreement, deliberately avoiding explicit acknowledgement of financial considerations or parental rights being terminated. The language in the Garrett-Thompson document is typical of efforts to create legal legitimacy for arrangements that existed in moral and legal gray areas. Michael points out that from a modern legal perspective, the transaction would likely be considered child trafficking or a form of indentured servitude, both serious crimes. However, applying contemporary legal standards to historical practices requires caution. In the early 20th century, children were often viewed more as economic assets and parental property than as individuals with independent rights. Practices that would horrify modern sensibilities, such as children working in dangerous factories, living in institutional settings with brutal discipline, or being sent away to work as domestic servants or farm laborers, were common and legal. The sale of children was more extreme but existed on a continuum of exploitative practices that society tolerated or actively facilitated. Eleanor also consults with a psychologist who specializes in trauma and child development. Dr. Sarah Nguyen reviews the information Eleanor has gathered about Samuel Thompson's later life and explains that children who experience early traumatic separation from parents often develop complex coping mechanisms. Some dissociate from early memories, creating a kind of psychological barrier between their past and present identities. Others remain consciously aware of their trauma but compartmentalize it, functioning normally in most areas of life while carrying unresolved pain. The fact that Samuel appeared to live a productive, stable life does not mean he was unaffected by his origins. His nightmares, his reluctance to discuss his childhood, and his generosity towards struggling families all suggest someone profoundly shaped by early experiences of loss, powerlessness, and economic desperation. In March 2019, Eleanor receives an unexpected email from a woman named Jennifer Garrett Wallace, who lives in Portland, Oregon. Jennifer explains that she is researching her family genealogy and discovered Eleanor's inquiries about Silas Garrett through shared messages in an online genealogy forum. Jennifer believes she is Silas's great-great-granddaughter, descended from his brother's line, and she has information that might interest Eleanor. They arrange a video call, and Jennifer shares what she has learned about Silas's life after he left Mitchell County. Jennifer has located records showing that Silas Garrett moved to Oklahoma Territory in late 1903, working in the oil fields around Tulsa. He remarried in 1906 to a widow named Martha Blackburn who had 2 children from her previous marriage. Silas and Martha had 1 child together, a daughter born in 1908. The family lived in modest circumstances, moving frequently as Silas followed work opportunities in the developing oil industry. He died in 1932 during the depths of the Great Depression, buried in a pauper's grave in Oklahoma City. His widow and children dispersed, and the family lost track of each other during the economic chaos of the 1930s. Jennifer found a letter among family papers written by Martha Garrett in 1945 to one of her sons from her first marriage. In the letter, Martha mentions that her late husband Silas had carried terrible guilt about something in his past, something involving a child he had left behind in North Carolina. Martha writes that Silas occasionally drank too much and would speak incoherently about having committed a sin for which there was no forgiveness, about a little boy he had betrayed. Martha says she never fully understood what Silas meant, whether he had abandoned a child, caused a child's death, or something else entirely. She writes that Silas's guilt seemed to intensify as he aged, becoming almost an obsession during his final years. Eleanor asks Jennifer how she feels learning that her ancestor participated in what essentially amounted to selling a child. Jennifer pauses for a long moment before responding. She says her initial reaction was shame and anger, a desire to distance herself from Silas and deny the connection. But as she researched further and learned about the context, the poverty, the isolation, the complete absence of social support systems, she began to feel something more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that Silas's action occurred within circumstances of genuine desperation. She wonders what she would do if faced with similar impossible choices, if she had a child she could not feed or care for and someone offered to take the child and provide a better life in exchange for money that might save the rest of the family. Eleanor finds Jennifer's perspective both troubling and valuable. It resists the temptation to render simple moral judgment while acknowledging the profound wrong that occurred. Eleanor realizes that her article needs to capture this complexity, to present the historical facts while recognizing the human dimensions of desperation, survival, love, and betrayal that shaped these events. She decides to structure the article around the photograph itself, using it as a focal point for discussing broader patterns of economic crisis, child displacement, and the moral compromises poverty forces upon people. As Eleanor works on the article, she makes one final attempt to identify other individuals visible in the baptism photograph. She shares high-resolution images with historians and descendants of Mitchell County families, asking if anyone recognizes the faces or can provide names. Several people respond with tentative identifications based on family resemblances and oral histories. One woman, in particular, catches Eleanor's attention. Standing at the edge of the frame, partially turned away from the camera, is a young woman whose expression appears particularly distressed. Several respondents suggest this might be Emma Garrett, Silas's younger sister, who would have been about 17 in 1903. Eleanor locates census records showing Emma Garrett living with her parents in Mitchell County through 1910, then marrying a local farmer named Thomas Hensley in 1912. Emma and Thomas had 5 children and lived their entire lives within a few miles of where Emma was born. Emma died in 1964 at age 78. Through genealogical connections, Eleanor identifies Emma's great-granddaughter, still living in Mitchell County, and arranges to visit. The great-granddaughter, Carol Hensley Barton, age 71, invites Eleanor to her home, a modest ranch house on a hillside overlooking valleys that have changed little in essential character since 1903. Carol serves sweet tea and pound cake, and they sit on a screened porch while Carol talks about her great-grandmother Emma. Carol explains that Emma rarely spoke about her early life, but Carol's grandmother, Emma's daughter, remembered her mother becoming visibly upset whenever the topic of children being taken away from families arose. This happened occasionally during the Depression years, when relatives or social workers would remove children from homes deemed too impoverished to care for them properly. Emma would react with unexpected intensity, arguing that families should never be separated regardless of poverty, that children belonged with their parents even in the worst circumstances. Carol's grandmother thought this reaction seemed excessive at the time but came to understand that Emma had witnessed something traumatic related to child separation. Carol excuses herself and returns carrying a small wooden box. Inside are personal items that belonged to Emma, things that passed through family members after her death. Among the items is a photograph, identical to the baptism image Eleanor has been studying, but with a handwritten note on the back. The handwriting is feminine, the ink faded but still legible. The note reads, August 17, 1903. The day Silas sold his boy. I will never forgive him and I will never forget that child's face. May God have mercy on all of us. The note is signed with Emma's initials. Eleanor's hands tremble as she holds the photograph. This is confirmation, direct testimony from someone present at the event, explicitly stating that the image documents not a baptism but a sale. She asks Carol if she can photograph the note and include it in her research. Carol agrees but says she wants Eleanor to understand something important. Emma may have written those words in anger and judgment, but Carol's grandmother said that Emma also spoke, late in life, about understanding why Silas made his choice. Emma told her daughter that the months after Cora died were the worst anyone in the family had ever experienced. They were starving, literally, and Silas was becoming physically and mentally unstable from grief, illness, and desperation. Emma said that Herschel Thompson had approached Silas, having heard through networks of church connections that there was a child in need of placement, and offered to take the boy and provide him with a good home. Thompson presented it as a Christian act, as rescue rather than purchase, though the money changed hands and everyone understood the transaction's true nature. Carol says Emma told her daughter that she always wondered whether Silas saved the boy's life or destroyed it. Would the child have survived the winter of 1903 and 1904 if he had stayed in the mountains? Would Silas have recovered enough to care for him properly? Or would poverty and illness have claimed them both, adding 2 more deaths to the countless tragedies of Appalachian hardship? Emma never learned what happened to her nephew after he left Mitchell County. She made inquiries once, in the 1920s, traveling to Asheville and asking around for the Thompson family. She learned that they lived prosperously, that their son Samuel attended good schools and would inherit a successful business, that he appeared healthy and well-adjusted. Emma said she felt relief mixed with resentment, grateful that the boy had survived while angry that his survival required being torn from his family and his origins. Eleanor leaves Mitchell County with photocopies of Emma's note and a deeper appreciation for the moral complexity of the events documented in the photograph. She understands now that everyone involved, Silas selling his son, the Thompsons purchasing a child, the witnesses who participated by their presence, Emma who watched and condemned but could not prevent, all of them were trapped in circumstances that offered no good choices. The transaction was wrong by any reasonable moral standard. It was also, given the context, perhaps inevitable. This tension between moral absolute and situational reality becomes the central theme of Eleanor's article. Eleanor Hartwell's article, Commerce at the Creek, Child Displacement and Economic Desperation in Appalachia, 1903, is published in the Journal of Southern History in August 2019, exactly 116 years after the events it describes. The article includes the baptism photograph, Emma's handwritten testimony, excerpts from relevant legal documents, and contextual analysis drawing on social history, economic records, and demographic data. Eleanor argues that the Garrett-Thompson transaction was neither exceptional nor particularly unusual but rather representative of broader patterns of child displacement that occurred throughout poor rural regions during periods of economic crisis. She estimates, based on available evidence, that hundreds or possibly thousands of similar transactions occurred in Appalachia between 1880 and 1930, most undocumented and now completely forgotten. The article generates significant response, both from academic historians and from the general public. Major newspapers run feature stories about the photograph and the research behind Eleanor's work. Social media amplifies the story, with thousands of people sharing the image and expressing shock, sadness, and anger about what it represents. Many readers struggle with the moral complexity Eleanor presents, preferring to view Silas Garrett as simply villainous and Samuel Thompson as purely victimized. Eleanor receives emails from readers demanding clearer condemnation of Silas's actions, refusing to accept any contextualization that might seem to excuse or minimize the wrong committed. Other readers, however, particularly those from Appalachian backgrounds or with family histories of poverty, respond differently. They share their own family stories of children sent away, of parents making impossible choices, of survival strategies that involved sacrificing individual welfare for collective benefit. One woman writes about her grandmother, who grew up in extreme poverty in Kentucky during the 1920s and was sent to work as a domestic servant for a wealthy family in Louisville at age 12. The arrangement was described as employment, but the girl received no wages, was given only room and board, and was not allowed to return home or maintain regular contact with her family. The woman writes that her grandmother lived to age 96 and achieved considerable success in life but never fully recovered from the psychological damage of feeling abandoned by her parents. Patricia Brennan, Samuel Thompson's granddaughter, contacts Eleanor after the article's publication. Patricia says she has shared the research with her family, including her 2 siblings and her surviving cousins. Reactions vary widely. Some family members are angry that Eleanor has published information that reflects poorly on the Thompson family's origins. They argue that Samuel built a good life, that his adoptive parents treated him well, and that digging up this history serves no purpose except to cause pain. Others feel vindicated in their sense that something had always been missing or unexplained in the family narrative. Patricia herself remains conflicted but ultimately grateful for Eleanor's work. She says that understanding her grandfather's origins has helped her make sense of aspects of his personality and behavior that previously seemed inexplicable. Patricia shares additional information with Eleanor that did not emerge during their initial conversations. Patricia's mother, Samuel's daughter, had found a small journal among her father's belongings after his death. The journal contained only a few entries, written during the final year of Samuel's life. In one entry, Samuel writes about a recurring dream in which he is standing in cold water, looking up at a man whose face he cannot quite see, feeling simultaneously terrified and resigned. Samuel writes that he knows this dream relates to something from his early childhood but cannot access the full memory. He describes feeling throughout his life as though he is 2 people, the successful businessman everyone knows and a small frightened boy who still exists somewhere inside him, waiting in that cold water for something terrible and inevitable to happen. In another entry, Samuel writes about his relationship with his adoptive parents. He describes them as fundamentally kind people who provided for him materially and never physically mistreated him. But he also writes about feeling like a project or an obligation rather than a beloved child, about sensing that his presence in the family served some need of theirs that he never fully understood. Samuel notes that he never called Herschel and Ida Mae Thompson father and mother, always referring to them by their first names or as Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Thompson. He writes that he chose not to have children initially because he feared he did not know how to be a proper parent, having never truly been a properly loved child himself. When his own children were born, he determined to love them in ways he had never been loved, with emotional openness and unconditional commitment. Eleanor incorporates some of this information into follow-up publications and presentations. She gives talks at universities, historical societies, and community organizations throughout the Southeast. At these events, she displays the photograph prominently and tells Samuel's story alongside Silas's story, emphasizing how both were shaped and damaged by the same forces of poverty, isolation, and social neglect. She argues that understanding this history is essential for recognizing how economic inequality produces multi-generational trauma and how the absence of adequate social support systems forces people into impossible moral positions. During a presentation at Appalachian State University, an elderly man approaches Eleanor afterward and introduces himself as Marcus Garrett. He explains that he is descended from Silas Garrett's brother and has been following Eleanor's research. Marcus says his family has always known vaguely about Silas's shameful act but never had details or documentation. He expresses appreciation for Eleanor's work while also noting that it has reopened painful family discussions. Some relatives feel that Eleanor is unfairly judging people who lived under circumstances modern Americans cannot truly imagine. Others believe the story needs to be told regardless of discomfort, that historical truth matters even when inconvenient or disturbing. Marcus shares a piece of information he recently discovered while researching his own family genealogy. He found a letter written in 1946 by his grandfather, Silas's brother, to a cousin in Texas. In the letter, Silas's brother mentions receiving word that his brother Silas had died years earlier in Oklahoma and that Silas's second wife had written asking if the family knew anything about a son Silas had left behind in North Carolina. The letter indicates that the family did know about Samuel, that some relatives had quietly tried to maintain awareness of what happened to him, and that they were relieved to learn he had done well in life. Silas's brother writes that knowing Samuel survived and prospered does not erase the wrong that was done but provides some small measure of comfort. Eleanor's research attracts the attention of documentary filmmakers who want to create a film about the photograph and the story it represents. She agrees to participate, and over the course of 2020, a small production team interviews Eleanor, Patricia Brennan, Jennifer Garrett Wallace, Carol Hensley Barton, and various historians and social scientists who can provide context. The filmmakers travel to Mitchell County and to Asheville, filming locations associated with the story. They find the creek where the photograph was taken, now somewhat changed by erosion and development but still recognizable from the image. They film the hillsides where Silas Garrett's property once stood and the downtown Asheville building where Samuel Thompson's store operated for decades. The documentary includes dramatic readings from Emma's note, from Samuel's journal, and from Constance Mercer's diaries. It presents the baptism photograph as a case study in how economic desperation transforms moral decision-making and how societies create conditions that force individuals into untenable positions. The film emphasizes that similar dynamics continue to operate in contemporary contexts, that poverty still compels parents to make choices regarding their children that no one should have to make. The documentary premieres at regional film festivals in 2021 and receives positive reviews, though some critics argue that it is too sympathetic to Silas Garrett and does not adequately condemn his actions. Eleanor continues her research, expanding beyond the specific case of Samuel Thompson to examine broader patterns of child displacement in American history. She identifies connections between early 20th century practices in Appalachia and contemporary issues such as family separations at the southern border, children removed from homes by overburdened child welfare systems, and international adoption practices that sometimes involve coercion or fraud. She argues that the fundamental dynamic, children treated as commodities to be transferred based on economic calculation rather than as individuals with inherent rights and intrinsic connections to their families and communities, persists across different contexts and time periods. In 2022, Eleanor organizes an academic conference titled The Economics of Childhood: Historical and Contemporary Perspectives on Child Displacement. The conference brings together historians, sociologists, legal scholars, psychologists, and advocates to examine how economic systems shape family structures and childhood experiences. The baptism photograph is featured prominently in conference materials and becomes a focal point for discussions about poverty, power, family integrity, and social responsibility. Several conference presentations specifically address the moral complexity Eleanor has emphasized, exploring how to acknowledge historical wrongs while understanding the constrained choices people faced. Patricia Brennan attends the conference and participates in a panel discussion about descendant perspectives on difficult family histories. She speaks movingly about learning her grandfather's origins and how that knowledge has changed her understanding of her own family identity. She notes that Samuel Thompson's descendants now number in the dozens, that his great-great-grandchildren include teachers, doctors, artists, and various other professionals, all of whom owe their existence to a transaction that was fundamentally wrong but also, in some sense, necessary for Samuel's survival. She asks how descendants should think about origins rooted in injustice but leading to lives that have value and meaning. Another panelist, a social worker who specializes in foster care and adoption, discusses how contemporary child welfare systems continue to struggle with tensions between family preservation and child safety, between respecting parental rights and ensuring children's welfare. She notes that economic poverty remains a primary factor in child removals, that families in crisis often lack resources and support rather than lacking love or commitment. She argues that society has made progress since 1903 in providing alternatives to family separation but still fails children by tolerating conditions that make adequate parenting nearly impossible for those without economic security. The conference proceedings are published as an edited volume in 2023, ensuring that the scholarship emerging from Eleanor's initial discovery reaches a broad academic audience. The baptism photograph appears on the book's cover, and Eleanor writes an introductory chapter that synthesizes the research and reflects on what has been learned. She notes that the photograph's power derives partly from its initial misidentification as a baptism. Baptism symbolizes spiritual rebirth, purification, entry into community, all positive associations. The actual event the photograph documents represents loss, severance, economic transaction disguised as religious or charitable act. This gap between appearance and reality, between what the image seems to show and what actually occurred, makes the photograph a powerful artifact for thinking about how economic desperation gets obscured or rationalized through cultural and religious frameworks. Eleanor concludes her introductory chapter by noting that no truly satisfactory resolution to the story exists. Samuel Thompson lived a good life, but that outcome does not justify the transaction that separated him from his biological father and original community. Silas Garrett acted out of genuine desperation, but that desperation does not excuse his decision to commodify his child. The Thompson family provided Samuel with material security and social advantages he would not have otherwise had, but they also participated in a fundamentally exploitative practice. Everyone involved was both victim and participant in a system that created impossible situations and then blamed individuals for the choices they made. Eleanor argues that recognizing this complexity is essential for thinking about contemporary issues involving children, poverty, and family integrity. In 2024, Eleanor receives a message through the university's website from a man named James Thompson, age 42, living in Denver, Colorado. James explains that he is Samuel Thompson's great-grandson, Patricia Brennan's first cousin, and he has just learned about Eleanor's research from family members. James writes that he has mixed feelings about the story becoming public but wants to contribute something to the historical record. He has in his possession a document that Samuel Thompson wrote in 1967, the year before his death, but never shared with anyone. Samuel's wife Ruth found the document after Samuel's death and kept it private, eventually giving it to James's father shortly before Ruth died in 1989. James's father read it once and then put it away, finding it too painful to revisit. After his father's recent death, James found the document while sorting through his estate. James shares a scanned copy of Samuel's document with Eleanor. It is handwritten on lined paper, 8 pages, titled simply, "My Earliest Memory." Samuel describes standing in cold water, looking up at a man wearing a dark coat and hat, feeling the man's hand on his head. He writes that he does not remember the man's face clearly but remembers the feeling of the hand, heavy and trembling. Samuel describes other people standing nearby, watching, some looking sad, one woman crying. He remembers feeling confused about what was happening, understanding that something important and bad was occurring but not comprehending what it meant. He describes being lifted from the water by different hands, warmer and gentler, belonging to a woman who smelled of lavender and spoke in a soothing voice he did not recognize. Samuel writes that his next clear memory is of being in a large house with unfamiliar furniture and strange people who treated him kindly but distantly. He remembers missing someone terribly, feeling an ache of loss that had no specific object because he could not remember clearly who or what he had lost. He describes years of feeling displaced, of knowing he belonged somewhere else but not knowing where, of watching other children with their parents and sensing that his relationship with the adults he lived with was somehow different and lesser. Samuel writes that he eventually stopped trying to remember his life before the creek, that the effort was too painful and seemed pointless since he could never return to whatever he had lost. The document continues with Samuel reflecting on his adult life. He writes about marrying Ruth and having children, about experiencing love for his own children that felt different from anything he had previously known. He describes the terror of recognizing how vulnerable children are, how completely dependent on their parents' choices and circumstances. He writes about his nightmares, which intensified after his first child was born, dreams in which he stands in cold water watching helplessly as his children are taken away by strangers. Samuel notes that he never discussed these dreams or his early memories with Ruth or with anyone else, believing that the past could not be changed and that dwelling on it served no purpose. In the final pages, Samuel addresses his unknown descendants directly. He writes that he is leaving this document for them to find after his death, whenever that might occur, so they will understand something about their origins that he could never speak about while alive. He acknowledges that the circumstances of his early childhood were unusual and painful, but insists that he had a good life, that he was fortunate in many ways, and that his adoptive parents, whatever their reasons for taking him, provided him with opportunities and security. He writes that he does not know whether his biological father is still alive, whether the man who stood in the water holding him down ever thought about him afterward or felt regret. Samuel says he has tried not to feel anger toward that man, whoever he was, recognizing that poverty and desperation can drive people to actions they would never choose under better circumstances. That Samuel's final paragraph addresses the question of forgiveness. He writes that he does not know if he has forgiven his biological father because he does not know what exactly there is to forgive. Was he saved from a life of grinding poverty and probable early death? Or was he stolen from his origins and forced to live as a permanent stranger to himself? Samuel notes that both perspectives seem partially true and that choosing between them feels impossible. He concludes by expressing hope that his descendants, when they eventually read this document, will live in a world where poverty no longer compels such terrible choices, where children are protected and valued regardless of their family's economic circumstances, where no parent ever has to decide between keeping their child and ensuring the child's survival. Eleanor incorporates Samuel's document into her ongoing work with his family's permission. The document is published in full in a historical journal, accompanied by Eleanor's contextual analysis and commentary from Patricia Brennan and other descendants. The publication generates renewed attention to the story, with major media outlets running retrospective pieces about the photograph, the research, and Samuel's posthumous testimony. Eleanor is invited to speak at national conferences, to participate in podcasts and documentary projects, and to advise policymakers working on issues related to child welfare, poverty, and family support systems. The photograph itself, the original print discovered in Margaret Holloway's attic, is donated to the Southern Appalachian Archives at the University of Tennessee, where it becomes part of a permanent collection documenting life in the region during the early 20th century. The archives create a digital exhibit featuring the photograph, Eleanor's research, primary documents including Emma's note and Samuel's memoir, and educational materials about child displacement in American history. The exhibit is accessed by thousands of students, researchers, and general public users, making the story widely known and ensuring it becomes part of the historical record. In 2025, Eleanor publishes a book-length study titled, Sothe, Child Commodification and Family Survival in American History. The baptism photograph serves as the book's entry point, but Eleanor expands the analysis to cover multiple time periods, regions, and contexts. She examines the sale of enslaved children in the antebellum South, the exploitation of immigrant and poor children in industrial settings, the forced removal of Native American children to boarding schools, the complex ethics of adoption and foster care, and contemporary issues such as commercial surrogacy and international adoption. Throughout, Eleanor argues that societies reveal their fundamental values through how they treat children, particularly children from marginalized or economically disadvantaged families. The book receives widespread critical acclaim and wins several academic awards. It is also controversial, with some reviewers arguing that Eleanor draws false equivalences between historically distinct practices or that her emphasis on economic systems minimizes individual moral responsibility. Eleanor responds that her intention is not to excuse exploitation but to identify root causes, to understand how decent people can participate in systems that harm children when alternative options are unavailable or unimaginable. She insists that moral clarity about what is wrong must be combined with structural analysis of why wrong things happen, otherwise reform becomes impossible. Patricia Brennan writes a personal essay about her experience learning and living with her grandfather's story. The essay is published in a major magazine and touches many readers who recognize similar complexities in their own family histories. Patricia writes about initially feeling shame about her origins, then anger at both Silas Garrett and the Thompson family, then gradually developing a more nuanced understanding. She describes visiting the creek in Mitchell County where the photograph was taken, standing in the cold water where her grandfather once stood, trying to imagine what he felt at age 4 as he looked up at the man who was sending him away. She writes about feeling connected to that frightened child across more than a century, about understanding that his trauma rippled forward through generations, affecting her grandfather's parenting, her mother's childhood experiences, and ultimately her own life. Patricia concludes her essay by reflecting on what responsibility descendants bear for wrongs committed by ancestors. She notes that she benefited indirectly from the transaction that harmed her grandfather, that her comfortable middle-class existence was made possible by Samuel's separation from his origins and his entry into a world of relative privilege. She questions whether she owes some debt to the Garrett family or to Appalachian communities still struggling with poverty and marginalization. She describes establishing a scholarship fund at Appalachian State University in Samuel Thompson's name, providing financial support to students from economically disadvantaged mountain communities. Patricia writes that this gesture cannot undo the past but represents an attempt to transform inherited harm into something constructive. Eleanor continues to receive messages from people who have discovered similar stories in their own families, photographs or documents or oral histories suggesting children displaced through economic transactions during periods of crisis. A pattern emerges in these messages. Most people initially react with shock and shame, wanting to keep the information private. Over time, many come to appreciate knowing the truth, however difficult, and recognizing that their ancestors' experiences fit into larger patterns of historical injustice. Some become advocates for contemporary child welfare reforms, drawing connections between past and present. Others focus on genealogical research, attempting to reconnect separated family lines and restore knowledge that was deliberately obscured. The story of the baptism photograph ultimately becomes a teaching case used in university courses on history, sociology, ethics, and social work. Students analyze the photograph, read primary documents, examine Eleanor's research methodology, and debate the moral and practical questions the case raises. Do desperate circumstances justify actions that violate fundamental ethical principles? What obligations do societies have to prevent situations where such choices become necessary? How should descendants think about and respond to difficult aspects of family history? What does justice mean in contexts where all participants were constrained by forces beyond their control? These questions generate passionate discussion, with students often drawing connections to contemporary issues they care deeply about. Eleanor Hartwell's career is transformed by the research emerging from that single photograph. She becomes known as a leading scholar of childhood, poverty, and historical injustice, her work influencing academic conversations and policy debates. But she remains most connected to the human stories at the center of her research, to Samuel Thompson standing in cold water not understanding what is being done to him, to Silas Garrett making an impossible choice that will haunt him for the rest of his life, to Emma watching and judging but also understanding, to Herschel and Ida Mae Thompson who wanted a child and saw an opportunity but perhaps never fully grasped the moral complexity of what they participated in, to Ruth Thompson Piesing. Together a hidden history her husband could not speak about, to Patricia Brennan and other descendants learning truths that challenge their understanding of who they are and where they come from. On the 122nd anniversary of the event documented in the photograph, August 17, 2025, Eleanor travels to Mitchell County for a commemoration ceremony. Local historians, descendants of families involved, community members, and students gather at the creek where the photograph was taken. The event is not celebratory but reflective, an acknowledgement of difficult history and a commitment to ensuring such circumstances never force similar choices. Patricia Brennan speaks about her grandfather's life and legacy. Carol Hensley Barton reads Emma's handwritten note. Marcus Garrett acknowledges his ancestors' role and expresses hope for healing and understanding across generations. Eleanor delivers closing remarks emphasizing that remembering this history honors both those who were harmed and those who struggled impossibly within unjust systems, and that real honor comes through building a world where economic desperation no longer threatens family integrity and child welfare. The creek continues to flow as it has for millennia, cold and clear, over rocks that witnessed an event whose moral weight still resonates more than a century later. The photograph that documented that moment remains in archival preservation, available to anyone who wants to study it, to learn from it, to think about what it reveals concerning human vulnerability, economic injustice, family bonds, and the terrible choices poverty creates. The small child standing in the water, frightened and uncomprehending, lived a long life and left descendants who continue to grapple with understanding where they come from. The man who sent him away died in obscurity and poverty, carrying guilt he could never fully express or resolve. Everyone else present that day, the witnesses who participated through their presence, lived their lives knowing they had seen something wrong occur but lacking power to prevent it. Their collective story, rescued from obscurity through historical research and transformed into public knowledge, becomes part of how we understand our past and imagine our future, a reminder of what happens when societies fail their most vulnerable members and leave families to make choices no one should have to make. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.